A queen waiting for Rome. Alexandria, 1st BCE. Morning light rises over a city that has spent centuries believing itself to be one of the centers of the world. Beyond its harbors stand palaces, built by a dynasty descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. Within its streets live Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, merchants, scholars, sailors, soldiers, and priests. Beyond them now comes Rome. And somewhere inside the royal quarter, Cleopatra VII knows that the world she has spent more than 20 years defending is almost gone. Mark Antony's armies are collapsing. His allies are deserting. Octavian, the young Roman rival whom history will later call Augustus, is closing around Alexandria. Cleopatra is 39 years old. She became queen at 18. She has survived a civil war against her own brother. She has lost and recovered a throne. She has dealt face-to-face with Julius Caesar. She has ruled beside a son publicly presented as Caesar's child. She has commanded enormous wealth, maintained fleets, negotiated territories, spoken to foreign peoples in their own languages, and bound her future to another of Rome's most powerful men. Now almost all of it has failed. Soon Antony will be dead. Soon Cleopatra will be dead. Her eldest son, Caesarion, will be hunted down. Her younger children will fall into Roman hands, and a dynasty that has ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries will end. Yet something stranger is about to happen, because Rome is not merely going to conquer Cleopatra's kingdom. Rome is going to help determine how posterity remembers Cleopatra herself. The ruler will become the seductress. The political alliance will become an intoxicating romance. A conflict for the Mediterranean world will increasingly be remembered as the story of powerful Roman men, ruined by an irresistible Eastern queen. Her beauty will become more famous than her government. Her lovers more famous than her languages. Her death more famous than her reign. And the serpent that may never even have killed her will become one of the most recognizable images in all of ancient history. There is only one problem. History is not nearly so simple. The sources that describe Cleopatra most vividly were overwhelmingly written by people living in the Roman world, many after she had lost. Modern historians therefore face a peculiar problem. Cleopatra is one of the most famous women who ever lived, and one of the hardest to hear in her own voice. So to find her, we have to move backwards, past Hollywood, past Shakespeare, past 2,000 years of fantasy, past Octavian's propaganda, back to Alexandria, back to the house of Ptolemy, back to a royal family in which power was inherited through blood, and very often preserved by spilling it. Title: Cleopatra. The queen Rome defeated, then rewrote. Historical basis: Cleopatra reigned from 51 to 30 BCE. Egypt became Roman after Octavian's victory. Modern scholarship stresses the scarcity of neutral contemporary testimony and the influence of Roman Augustan representations on her surviving image. Chapter 1. She was born into the wrong kind of fairy tale. Cleopatra's story did not begin with pyramids. That point matters. When Cleopatra lived, the Great Pyramid at Giza was already more than 2,000 years old. She belonged to a much later Egypt, an Egypt conquered by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE. After Alexander died, his enormous empire fractured among his commanders. One of them was Ptolemy. In 305 BCE, he became Ptolemy I, founding the dynasty that would rule Egypt until Cleopatra's death. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greek in origin, but they ruled an overwhelmingly Egyptian kingdom. So they learned the ancient art of political adaptation. To the Greek-speaking Mediterranean world, they could appear as Hellenistic monarchs. Within Egyptian temples, they appeared as pharaohs. Their images stood before Egyptian gods. Priests gave their kingship sacred legitimacy. Greek and Egyptian traditions did not simply replace one another. They existed together, sometimes uneasily, sometimes brilliantly, in one of antiquity's most extraordinary kingdoms. And at its northern edge stood Alexandria, not an old pharaonic capital but a Mediterranean metropolis, a city facing outward, a city of royal palaces, docks, commerce, scholarship, and monumental ambition, a city associated with the great library and museum, a city where ideas, languages, religions, and fortunes arrived by sea. This was Cleopatra's world, not the silent desert kingdom imagined by later cinema. A cosmopolitan, politically dangerous, intellectually ambitious Mediterranean monarchy. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE. Her father was Ptolemy III, often known by the nickname Olitz, the flute player. Her mother's identity is not securely known, and that uncertainty matters, because modern arguments sometimes claim far more certainty about Cleopatra's complete ancestry than the evidence permits. What we can say confidently is that she belonged to the Macedonian Greek Ptolemaic royal house. What we cannot honestly do is manufacture a complete family tree where the ancient record leaves gaps. But there was another inheritance far more important than ancestry. Chapter 2, A Crown at Aeta. In 51 BCE, Ptolemy XIII died. Cleopatra was about 18. The throne passed to Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Later retellings often describe the young pair simply as husband and wife, because sibling marriage was a feature of Ptolemaic royal practice. But the evidence for a formal marriage between Cleopatra and Ptolemy III is not as secure as popular storytelling sometimes suggests. What is certain is more important. They were co-rulers, and they became enemies. Cleopatra inherited no peaceful golden kingdom. Egypt was experiencing severe pressure. Poor Nile floods aggravated hardship. Famine threatened. The treasury and administration existed inside a world increasingly dependent on Roman politics. A teenage queen had inherited a state whose sovereignty was already narrowing, and almost immediately power became personal. Around Ptolemy XIII stood powerful courtiers, especially the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achillas, and the rhetorician Theodotus. Cleopatra attempted to rule with an authority that seems to have exceeded what her brother's faction was willing to tolerate. The struggle escalated. Eventually she was pushed from Alexandria. Think about that moment. The woman posterity remembers as the Queen of Egypt was, for a time, a queen without her capital. She went east. She gathered forces. She prepared to fight her own brother for the throne. Two rival Ptolemaic armies eventually faced one another near the Egyptian frontier, and then the largest political conflict in the Mediterranean suddenly crashed directly into their family war. Rome arrived, not as a negotiator, as a corpse. Historical basis: Cleopatra succeeded Ptolemy XIII in 51 BCE alongside Ptolemy III. Contemporary scholarship also notes serious hardship from poor Nile floods in the opening years of her reign. Chapter 3, Pompey's Head. Rome itself was tearing apart. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, once allies, had become enemies in a civil war. In 48 BCE, Caesar defeated Pompey at Pharsalus. Pompey fled. He sailed to Egypt. It must have seemed a reasonable choice. He had connections to Cleopatra's father. Egypt was wealthy. A king sat on its throne. Perhaps Pompey expected shelter. Instead, the advisors of Ptolemy III made a calculation. They believed Caesar was now the stronger man, so when Pompey approached the Egyptian shore, he was murdered. His head was cut from his body. Then Caesar arrived in Alexandria. The Egyptians presented him with Pompey's head. They had intended it as a gift. Ancient tradition tells us it horrified him. Whatever Caesar had become to Pompey in politics, Pompey had once been his ally, his son-in-law, one of the greatest Romans of his generation. Egypt's court had attempted to buy Caesar's favor with the head of a Roman statesman. It had misread its audience. And now Caesar was in Alexandria with soldiers, money owed to him, Roman authority behind him, and two Ptolemaic siblings demanding the same throne. He announced that he would arbitrate. For Cleopatra, the problem was obvious. Her brother controlled Alexandria. Her brother's ministers controlled access. If Caesar heard only their version of the dispute, Cleopatra might lose the kingdom without ever entering the room. So she devised one of the boldest entrances in political history. And no, it probably did not involve a carpet. Historical basis: Plutarch describes Caesar's reaction to Pompey's murder and the Alexandrian crisis. Chapter 4, The Carpet That Wasn't a Carpet. For centuries, painters and filmmakers have loved the scene. A carpet is carried into Caesar's quarters. It is unfurled. Cleopatra rolls out. Caesar is astonished. Cinema could hardly ask for anything better. But Plutarch, the ancient writer, responsible for the famous story, does not actually describe a carpet. He says Cleopatra came secretly at night in a small boat with only one companion, Apollodorus the Sicilian. Because entering unnoticed was otherwise impossible, she stretched herself inside what the translation calls a bed sack. Apollodorus tied it with a cord, then carried the bundle into Caesar's quarters. It is still theatrical, perhaps even more so. But it was not merely a flirtatious stunt. It was a political operation. Cleopatra was an exiled monarch penetrating a palace controlled by her enemies in order to secure direct access to the most powerful man currently standing in Egypt. She was about 21. Caesar was more than 30 years older. Plutarch tells us that her audacity impressed him. A relationship developed between them. How quickly political alliance became personal intimacy cannot be reconstructed minute by minute, and historians should resist pretending that it can. But the political logic is unmistakable. Cleopatra needed restoration. Caesar needed stability, money, and an Egyptian settlement that served Roman interests. Their desires did not have to be identical for their alliance to work. That distinction is essential. Cleopatra did not enter Caesar's story as a woman wandering into Roman power. She entered as a claimant to a kingdom, and Caesar did not enter hers as merely a lover. He entered with legions, historical basis. Plutarch specifically describes the small boat, Apollodorus, and the tied bedsack. The famous carpet is a later transformation of the story. Chapter 5, The War Inside a Palace. Caesar's decision did not end the dynastic conflict. It detonated it. Ptolemy XIII's faction resisted. Alexandria became a battlefield. Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe, escaped from Caesar's control and joined the anti-Caesarian side, becoming a royal figurehead for resistance. Now Cleopatra was not simply at war with one brother. Another sibling had entered the contest. The struggle was dangerous enough that Caesar himself came close to catastrophe. Ancient accounts describe fighting around the harbor in Pharos. The conflict spread across Alexandria. Later generations would also connect Caesar's campaign with fire and the fate of books in Alexandria, though the scale and target of that destruction have been debated so intensely that a responsible documentary should not repeat the popular line that Caesar burned down the entire Library of Alexandria as settled fact. Eventually, Roman reinforcements helped turn the war. Ptolemy XIII was defeated. He died during the collapse of his forces, traditionally described as drowning in the Nile. Cleopatra's throne was restored. But in Ptolemaic Egypt, a queen could not simply become an uncomplicated solitary monarch. She was now formally associated with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. Arsinoe was taken away. She would later be displayed in Caesar's Roman triumph, a living symbol of conquered Egypt before being spared and sent into exile at Ephesus. Cleopatra had survived the first great war of her reign, but she had survived it because Egyptian dynastic politics and Roman military power had become inseparable. She had recovered her crown. She had also learned exactly what Rome could do to a defeated queen. It is worth remembering Arsinoe's humiliation. Years later, when Cleopatra herself faced the possibility of being carried through Octavian's triumph, she knew precisely what such a fate looked like. She had seen it happen to her own sister. Historical basis: Caesar restored Cleopatra with her younger brother after the Alexandrian War, Suetonius. Likewise, records that Caesar left Egypt under Cleopatra and her younger brother rather than immediately annexing it. Chapter 6, The Child with Caesar's Name. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Ptolemaic Egypt. History knows him better by his nickname, Caesarion, Little Caesar. And here we must separate political certainty from biological certainty. Cleopatra presented Caesarion as Julius Caesar's son. Ancient writers argued over the claim. Octavian later had every political reason to deny it. Modern historians still cannot perform the one test that would settle the matter completely. So the responsible wording is not, Caesarion was definitely Caesar's son, nor is it, Caesarion was definitely not Caesar's son. The evidence makes Caesar's paternity plausible and politically enormously important, but not scientifically provable. And politics cared about perception. A boy carrying Caesar's name could become dangerous. For now, however, Caesar was alive. Cleopatra later traveled to Rome. She was there during the period before Caesar's assassination. Whatever Romans thought of her personally, she represented a kingdom of enormous wealth and strategic importance. Then on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, Caesar was stabbed to death. Once again, Cleopatra's political universe changed in a single day. The man who had helped restore her throne was gone. Rome fell into another cycle of violence. Cleopatra returned to Egypt, Soon afterwards, Ptolemy XIV died. Ancient hostile tradition has implicated Cleopatra in his death, and modern scholars recognize how politically convenient his disappearance was, but convenience is not proof. We should therefore say exactly what the evidence allows. His death removed another possible dynastic rival. How he died cannot be demonstrated with certainty. Caesarion became Cleopatra's co-ruler. The queen now stood beside a child whose very existence was potentially an argument about who possessed Caesar's legacy, and far away in Rome, another young man was beginning to build his future around that same name, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted heir, the future Octavian, the future Augustus, one Caesar by adoption, one Caesar by Cleopatra's claim. Sooner or later, those two versions of succession were going to become impossible to ignore. Historical basis. Caesarion's paternity remains a matter of historical debate. The evidence and later propaganda must be handled cautiously. Ptolemy XIV's death likewise generated ancient accusations that cannot simply be reported as proven murder. Chapter 7. The Cleopatra Hollywood almost missed. Before we go further, we should meet Cleopatra without Caesar, without Antony, without romance, because this is where popular culture has most often diminished her. Plutarch, hardly a writer determined to flatter, Cleopatra preserves a remarkable description. He says that her physical beauty, taken by itself, was not so incomparable that no other woman could rival it. What captivated people was something more difficult to paint. Her conversation, her presence, the character that accompanied her words, the quality of her voice. He also describes her linguistic ability. Cleopatra could communicate with numerous peoples without relying habitually on interpreters. And Plutarch makes an extraordinary observation. Earlier, Ptolemies had scarcely bothered to learn Egyptian. Cleopatra did. That fact deserves more attention than 1,000 arguments about whether her nose was beautiful. Imagine the political intelligence behind it. She belonged to a Macedonian Greek dynasty ruling Egypt. Learning the language of Egyptian subjects was not merely an educational accomplishment. It helped place her inside a kingdom her ancestors had ruled for generations while often remaining linguistically distant from much of its population. She also embraced Egyptian religious kingship. In Egyptian settings, she could be represented as pharaoh. Later, in the political theater of her alliance with Antony, her association with Isis became particularly important. This does not mean Cleopatra was secretly modern, democratic, or benevolent. She was a Hellenistic monarch. She could be ruthless. She defended dynastic power. She lived in a political culture where relatives could be killed because they represented alternative claims to legitimacy. But reducing that woman to beautiful seductress is not history. It is a loss of information. The historical Cleopatra is more interesting, precisely because she does not require innocence to be formidable. She could speak beautifully and act brutally. She could calculate, adapt, perform, negotiate, rule, and perhaps Cleopatra's most powerful instrument was never her face. It was her capacity to understand what different audiences needed to see. Historical basis. Plutarch explicitly distinguishes Cleopatra's attractiveness from simple, incomparable beauty and emphasizes her conversation, voice, and multilingual ability, including knowledge of Egyptian. Surviving coinage gives us contemporary royal portraits, rather than a reliable modern beauty verdict. Chapter 8. Rome summons the queen. After Caesar's death, 3 men emerged as Rome's dominant power brokers: Octavian, Mark Antony, Lepidus. Together they formed the Second Triumvirate. But alliances in the late Roman Republic were temporary architecture, built over permanent ambition. Antony took responsibility for much of the eastern Mediterranean, and in 41 BCE he summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus. He wanted explanations regarding Egypt's conduct during the wars that followed Caesar's assassination. Popular legend has often turned what happened next into another seduction scene. But first understand the balance of power. Antony possessed Roman military authority. Cleopatra possessed something Rome repeatedly needed: Egypt. Money, ships, grain, geography. A royal government in the eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra did not sail to Tarsus as a woman hoping a Roman would notice her. She arrived as a monarch whose alliance mattered. And Plutarch gives us one of the most unforgettable entrances ever written, about an ancient ruler. Cleopatra sailed up the river Cydnus. The stern of her vessel glittered with gold. Purple sails caught the wind. Silver oars moved to music. Incense drifted over the water. Attendants were arranged like figures in a divine tableau. Cleopatra herself was presented in the imagery of Aphrodite. Word spread through the city. People abandoned the marketplace to see her. Antony, Plutarch says, was left sitting as the crowd disappeared. Whether every ornamental detail survived precisely as Plutarch tells it is impossible to prove. He was writing long after the event. But the political logic of the spectacle is entirely credible. Cleopatra understood something modern leaders still understand. Power is not only possessed, power is staged. Antony had summoned her. She transformed the summons into an entrance. He expected a defendant. Alexandria sent a queen. Historical basis. Plutarch's account of Tarsus describes the gilded vessel. Purple sails, silver oars, music, and incense. It should be presented as his famous, ancient account rather than camera-like eyewitness certainty. Chapter 9. Antony and Cleopatra. Something developed between them. Alliance. Intimacy. Political dependence. Pleasure. Ambition. Perhaps love. History cannot place these elements on a scale and give each a percentage, and that may be why Antony and Cleopatra remain so compelling. Their relationship refuses to fit cleanly into either cynical politics or perfect romance. They spent time together in Alexandria. Plutarch preserves colorful stories of banquets, jokes, fishing expeditions, and a social circle later, remembered as the inimitable livers. We should enjoy those stories, but cautiously. Ancient biography loved revealing character through anecdote. Not every dinner table tale deserves the confidence of an inscription. What is certain is that the relationship had consequences. Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene. Antony later returned west. In 40 BCE, as part of Roman political reconciliation, he married Octavian's sister Octavia. This was no small complication. Antony was now tied by marriage to the family of his greatest Roman rival while maintaining a powerful Eastern relationship with Cleopatra. For a time, Roman politics held. Then it began to split again. Antony returned to the east. He reunited with Cleopatra. They had another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, and their political partnership deepened. Antony needed resources for his eastern military ambitions, particularly against Parthia. Cleopatra wanted territory, security, and the rebuilding of Ptolemaic influence. The relationship was not occurring outside geopolitics. It was geopolitics, and it became increasingly dangerous to Octavian, not because Cleopatra had cast a magical spell over Rome, because Antony commanded Roman armies. Cleopatra commanded one of the richest kingdoms in the Mediterranean. Together, they could create an Eastern power, structure capable of challenging the political future Octavian wanted for himself. That is a far more serious threat than romance. Historical basis, modern biographies, emphasize the political and military setting of the Antony-Cleopatra relationship rather than treating it purely as a love affair. Chapter 9. Antony and Cleopatra. Something developed between them. Alliance. Intimacy. Political dependence. Pleasure. Ambition. Perhaps love. History cannot place these elements on a scale and give each a percentage, and that may be why Antony and Cleopatra remain so compelling. Their relationship refuses to fit cleanly into either cynical politics or perfect romance. They spent time together in Alexandria. Plutarch preserves colorful stories of banquets, jokes, fishing expeditions, and a social circle later, remembered as the inimitable livers. We should enjoy those stories, but cautiously. Ancient biography loved revealing character through anecdote. Not every dinner table tale deserves the confidence of an inscription. What is certain is that the relationship had consequences. Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene. Antony later returned west. In 40 BCE, as part of Roman political reconciliation, he married Octavian's sister Octavia. This was no small complication. Antony was now tied by marriage to the family of his greatest Roman rival while maintaining a powerful Eastern relationship with Cleopatra. For a time, Roman politics held. Then it began to split again. Antony returned to the east. He reunited with Cleopatra. They had another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, and their political partnership deepened. Antony needed resources for his eastern military ambitions, particularly against Parthia. Cleopatra wanted territory, security, and the rebuilding of Ptolemaic influence. The relationship was not occurring outside geopolitics. It was geopolitics, and it became increasingly dangerous to Octavian, not because Cleopatra had cast a magical spell over Rome, because Antony commanded Roman armies. Cleopatra commanded one of the richest kingdoms in the Mediterranean. Together, they could create an Eastern power structure capable of challenging the political future Octavian wanted for himself. That is a far more serious threat than romance. Historical basis, modern biographies, emphasize the political and military setting of the Antony-Cleopatra relationship rather than treating it purely as a love affair. Chapter 10. The Queen becomes Isis. In 34 BCE, after Antony's Armenian campaign, Alexandria became the stage for an extraordinary royal ceremony. Today we call it the Donations of Alexandria. Antony and Cleopatra appeared before a vast audience. Royal children were elevated. Territories were distributed symbolically among them. Cleopatra was affirmed as Queen of Egypt and other territories. Caesarion was elevated beside her. Their children received grand dynastic titles. Plutarch tells us that Cleopatra appeared in the sacred dress associated with Isis and was addressed as the new Isis. To an Eastern Hellenistic monarchy, this kind of dynastic display could express legitimacy, divinity, and imperial ambition. To Octavian's supporters in Rome, it was political treasure. Here was Antony, a Roman triumvir, seated within an Eastern royal spectacle. Here was Cleopatra, a foreign queen surrounded by territories and children. Here was Caesarion, publicly associated with Julius Caesar. Here was the possibility, real, exaggerated or imagined, of a rival order in the East. Octavian could work with this. And he did, because military wars are often won first by deciding what the war is about. Historical basis. Plutarch records the Donations of Alexandria, Cleopatra's royal titles, the children's elevations, and her appearance as the new Isis. Chapter 11. Octavian's masterpiece. Octavian was not yet Augustus. He was still fighting to become the man Augustus would later be. And Antony was not a foreign invader. He was Roman, popular, experienced, a former associate of Julius Caesar, commander of Roman soldiers. That created a problem. How do you persuade Romans to fight another vast Roman civil war? You change the villain. Cleopatra was perfect. Foreign, royal, female, immense in wealth, associated with Egypt, connected to divine imagery, alien enough to Roman audiences to be useful. Octavian's propaganda increasingly presented Antony as a Roman corrupted by the East and dominated by Cleopatra. The message was politically elegant. Antony was no longer simply Octavian's Roman rival. He was a man who had abandoned Roman values under the influence of an alien queen. Octavian obtained Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins. Plutarch records that he read parts of it publicly. Among the explosive elements was Antony's wish to be buried with Cleopatra in Alexandria. Even some Romans who disliked Antony were uncomfortable that Octavian had exposed a living man's private testament. But politically, the damage was extraordinary. Buried in Alexandria, beside Cleopatra? What did that say about where Antony imagined his true center of power? Octavian's case did not need to be fair. It needed to be memorable. And then came the most revealing move of all. The formal war was directed against Cleopatra. Think about the genius of that framing. If Rome declared war on Antony, it looked like civil war. If Rome declared war on Cleopatra, Octavian could present himself as defending Rome from a foreign monarch. The reality remained more complicated. Roman fought Roman. Antony still commanded Roman armies. But language had transformed the conflict. This is why describing Cleopatra merely as the woman who caused Antony's downfall repeats the architecture of Octavian's own political narrative. Cleopatra was not innocent of ambition. Neither was Antony. Neither was Octavian. This was a struggle for power in a collapsing republican world. But one side would survive to explain what the struggle had meant. Historical basis, Plutarch records, Octavian's acquisition and public use of Antony's will and the formal decision to make war on Cleopatra. Academic scholarship emphasizes misogynistic and anti-Eastern elements in the propaganda campaign. Chapter 12, Actium. Speaking September 31 BCE, off the western coast of Greece, two enormous political futures met on water. On one side, Antony and Cleopatra. On the other, Octavian's forces, with the brilliant Admiral Marcus Agrippa playing a crucial military role. This is the Battle of Actium, and for centuries it has been told through one irresistible scene. Cleopatra suddenly flees. Antony sees her ship leaving. He forgets duty, honor, army, and empire. He follows the woman he loves. A commander throws away the world for passion. It is magnificent tragedy. It is also not the only way historians interpret what happened. The ancient moralizing tradition strongly encouraged the image of Antony becoming irrational because of Cleopatra. Modern military historians have reconstructed another possibility, that a breakout had been planned. Barry Strauss, among those who have re-examined the battle, argues that Cleopatra's squadron was part of an agreed attempt to break through if the battle could not be won conventionally. This does not magically convert Actium into a secret victory. It was not. The consequences were disastrous, but it changes the meaning of the escape. Was Cleopatra panicking or executing a contingency? Did Antony irrationally abandon victory or join an attempted breakout from a position already becoming strategically impossible? We cannot watch the battle again. The evidence does not allow absolute certainty, so this documentary will not pretend there is certainty where historians still debate. What we can say is that Agrippa's operations had severely pressured Antony's strategic position. When Cleopatra's ships broke away, Antony followed. The surviving fleet escaped toward Egypt. The forces left behind did not create a miraculous recovery. Antony's cause began to disintegrate. Actium was not simply one battle lost. It was the moment when the future began closing. After Actium, allies defected. Territories shifted. Octavian had momentum. Antony and Cleopatra still had a kingdom, but increasingly they had no world outside it. Historical basis. Actium took place on 2nd September 31st BCE. Ancient accounts emphasize Cleopatra's flight. Modern historians, including Barry Strauss, argue for a prearranged breakout strategy. The precise tactical intent remains debated and should not be presented as certain. Chapter 13. The last year. They returned to Alexandria, the city that had once seemed capable of containing an entire Mediterranean future now became a waiting room. Octavian did not rush blindly. He advanced. Pressure mounted. Negotiations were attempted. Cleopatra still had money, treasure, children, a crown. Perhaps those things could buy survival. Perhaps a settlement. Perhaps Caesarian's inheritance. Perhaps Egypt. Perhaps something. But Octavian no longer needed the partnership Cleopatra had once offered Caesar. He needed the end of a rival dynasty. Cleopatra prepared a monumental tomb or mausoleum near a temple of Isis. Plutarch says she gathered royal treasure there. Gold, silver, precious objects, combustible material. The message was clear. If Octavian attempted to seize everything by force, Cleopatra could destroy the treasure with herself. Even at the end, she was bargaining. Then Alexandria fell. Antony received a report that Cleopatra was dead. The report was false. Believing it, he attempted to kill himself. The wound did not finish him immediately. Then word came. Cleopatra was alive. Antony asked to be taken to her. And history gives us a scene so brutal and intimate that fiction scarcely needs to improve it. Cleopatra had sealed herself inside the monument. She would not open the doors. Instead, she appeared at a window above. Ropes were lowered. The dying Antony was fastened to them. Cleopatra and the two women with her pulled. Imagine the weight, not merely of a wounded man, of everything they had attempted. The campaigns, the banquets, the children, the ceremonies, the argument with Rome, the vanished fleets, the entire Eastern dream being hauled bleeding up a wall. Plutarch calls it a pitiful sight. Antony was brought inside. He died. For generations, the world had remembered Antony and Cleopatra as lovers. Now one of them had become a body in the other's arms, and Cleopatra still had one final adversary to face. Octavian. Historical basis. Plutarch describes Cleopatra in her sealed monument, Antony's failed suicide, and the extraordinary episode in which the Mortally wounded, Antony was hauled through the window with ropes. Chapter 14. The Queen and the Man Who Would Become Augustus. This meeting was unlike Cleopatra's meeting with Caesar. Unlike Tarsus, no dramatic entrance could reverse what had happened. The armies had already spoken. Octavian was the victor, but Cleopatra was not yet simply a prisoner. She still had information. Treasure, children, symbolic value. Octavian wanted something too. Ancient sources tell us he hoped to display Cleopatra in his Roman triumph. Imagine what that would mean. The Queen of Egypt walking as a captive, a living trophy. Rome watching the woman its propaganda had transformed into an existential threat. Cleopatra would have understood the humiliation intimately. Her sister Arsinoe had once been paraded in Caesar's triumph. Cleopatra had seen what Roman victory did with royal bodies. She negotiated with Octavian. The ancient sources dramatize the encounter in different ways and are fascinated by whether she attempted one final exercise of charm. We should be careful. The theatrical temptation is obvious. But by this stage, Octavian's political calculation mattered more than whether Cleopatra could still enchant a room. He needed her alive if she could enhance his triumph. She needed to know whether survival meant life or spectacle. A young Roman named Dolabella, according to Plutarch, secretly warned her that Octavian planned to send her and her children away within days. If that warning is true, the remaining choices became terribly narrow. Cleopatra visited Antony's tomb. She returned. She bathed. She dressed. She ate. Then a basket of figs entered the story. And with it, the most famous snake in history. Historical basis, Suetonius says, Octavian strongly wished to preserve Cleopatra alive for his triumph. Plutarch's final days account includes Dolabella's warning and Cleopatra's preparations before death. Chapter 15. Did the asp kill Cleopatra? Ask almost anyone how Cleopatra died. They know. A snake. An asp. It bites the queen. She dies. The image is so perfect that it feels like evidence. It is not. Plutarch himself gives competing accounts. In one version, a snake is hidden among figs. In another, it may have been concealed in a container. Another tradition involves poison carried in a hollow implement, and Plutarch ultimately admits uncertainty. No snake was found in the chamber. There were reports of small punctures on Cleopatra's arm, but even those did not settle the matter. Suetonius, writing later, says Octavian brought specialists in an attempt to draw out venom because it was believed an asp had killed her. Believed. Not proved. That distinction matters. Cleopatra may have died from snake venom. She may have used poison. Some combination may have been involved. The exact mechanism remains unknown. So the most historically accurate sentence is also the most haunting. We know that Cleopatra chose death. We do not know exactly how she achieved it. When the doors were opened, Cleopatra was dead. Iris, one of her attendants, was dying. Charmian, the other, was still alive long enough for one final image to enter the historical imagination. We should receive the scene with both emotion and caution, but the broad fact remains. Cleopatra was dead, 39 years old, queen for roughly 21 years. Antony dead, Egypt defeated, and Octavian had lost the living queen he hoped to display. Cleopatra could no longer control her kingdom, but she had denied Rome control of the final performance of her body. Historical basis. Plutarch explicitly presents multiple possible methods of Cleopatra's suicide and concedes that the truth was unknown. No snake was found. Suetonius records Octavian's attempt to counteract suspected snake venom. Chapter 16. The child who could not be allowed to live. Cleopatra was dead, but her dynasty was not quite finished. Caesarion was still alive, and Caesarion possessed one quality that made him uniquely dangerous. His name. The young king had been presented as Caesar's son. Octavian's entire political identity rested on being Julius Caesar's adopted heir. 2 Caesars were 1 Caesar too many. Caesarion attempted to flee. Ancient accounts say he was persuaded to return. Octavian had him killed. The exact politics behind that decision hardly require imagination. A living Caesarion could become a symbol, a rival, a banner around which discontent might gather. Dead boys cannot claim empires. Cleopatra's children by Antony were spared. They were taken into Octavian's custody and ultimately raised within the household. of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife and Octavian's sister. That ending contains one of history's strangest ironies. The children of Antony and Cleopatra were cared for by the woman Antony had left behind, and one of those children did not disappear. Cleopatra Selene grew up. She married Juba II. She became Queen of Mauritania in North Africa. Through her, something of the Alexandrian dynasty continued in another court. Cleopatra had lost Egypt, but not every branch of her family vanished with her. Historical basis: Suetonius records the killing of Caesarion and Octavian's sparing of Antony and Cleopatra's other children. Chapter 17. Egypt becomes Rome's. With Cleopatra gone, the Ptolemaic monarchy ended. The kingdom that had begun under one of Alexander's generals nearly 3 centuries earlier was absorbed into Roman power. Octavian would become Augustus in 27 BCE, the first Roman emperor. Egypt became extraordinarily important to the new imperial order. Its grain, its wealth, its strategic position, the same kingdom Cleopatra had spent her life attempting to preserve became part of the political structure of the man who defeated her. And this is where the second life of Cleopatra begins. Not her biological life, her historical life. Because victors inherit more than territory. They inherit the first opportunity to explain the victory. Octavian's regime had every reason to portray the war in moral terms, favorable to itself. Roman poetry and historiography repeatedly imagined Cleopatra as dangerous, luxurious, alien, sexually powerful, destabilizing. This does not mean every hostile ancient statement is automatically false. That would simply replace one bad method with another. Cleopatra did exercise hard power. She pursued dynastic ambition. Her enemies sometimes died. Her alliance with Antony truly did threaten Octavian's political future. She was not invented by propaganda, but the shape of her memory was profoundly affected by it. The nuance slowly disappeared, and a simpler character emerged. The dangerous queen from the east. Historical basis. After Cleopatra's death, Rome annexed Egypt. Modern scholarship stresses how Augustan and later Roman literary traditions shaped her hostile image. Chapter 18. Was Cleopatra beautiful? 2,000 years later, the question still follows her. Was Cleopatra beautiful? But perhaps we should ask why this is the question that survived. We possess coins struck during Cleopatra's lifetime. They show a strong profile, a prominent nose, a firm chin, a royal diadem. Some portraits are deliberately stylized. Coins are political objects, not passport photographs. A ruler's image can communicate dynasty, legitimacy, and authority rather than photographic prettiness. The British Museum preserves surviving coin portraits of Cleopatra. Other sculptural heads have been proposed as representations of her, though even museum catalogs warn that some identifications are disputed. So anyone who claims to reconstruct Cleopatra's exact face with absolute confidence is offering more certainty than archaeology can supply. Yet Plutarch gives us something better than a beauty score. He tells us her presence was compelling. Her conversation had force. Her voice mattered. Her intelligence and linguistic skill mattered. That testimony comes from an ancient tradition hardly interested in turning Cleopatra into a feminist icon, which makes it especially valuable. Perhaps the obsession with Cleopatra's beauty tells us less about Cleopatra and more about the kinds of explanations later cultures preferred for powerful women. If Caesar and Antony valued her, surely beauty must explain it. But why should that be enough? She was a queen. She controlled resources. She commanded a fleet. She governed a strategically critical kingdom. She could speak across cultures. She could perform monarchy in Greek and Egyptian political languages. She was capable of becoming indispensable to Roman men who themselves were fighting for supremacy. Beauty may have been part of her presence. It was not her resume. Historical basis: the British Museum holds contemporary coin, portraits of Cleopatra, and cautions against overconfident identification of some sculptural portraits. Plutarch's account emphasizes presence and communication rather than incomparable physical beauty. Chapter 19. Was Cleopatra Egyptian? Another modern question often arrives with surprising certainty. Was Cleopatra Greek or Egyptian? The historically careful answer begins by refusing to force the ancient world into a modern checkbox. Cleopatra belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from Macedonian Greek rulers who took control of Egypt after Alexander. That is secure. She was born in Egypt. She ruled Egypt. She held pharaonic kingship. She participated in Egyptian religious ideology. She learned Egyptian, apparently unlike most of her Ptolemaic predecessors. Her mother's identity is uncertain, therefore claims that confidently reconstruct every element of her ancestry go beyond what can actually be demonstrated. Cleopatra was a Hellenistic monarch of a Macedonian Greek royal house who became one of the most deeply Egyptian-facing rulers of her dynasty. That answer may be less useful for modern culture wars. It is much more useful for history. Historical basis. The Ptolemaic dynasty descended from the Macedonian conquerors of Egypt. Cleopatra's maternal ancestry is not securely established, while ancient testimony credits her with knowledge of Egyptian. Chapter 20. From Plutarch to Shakespeare to Elizabeth Taylor, Cleopatra's physical kingdom died. Her imaginative kingdom grew. Ancient writers turned her into warning, spectacle, and tragedy. Centuries later, Shakespeare gave Antony and Cleopatra one of literature's great doomed relationships. Painters placed the serpent at her breast. Novelists entered her private rooms. Opera gave her a voice. Cinema gave her a face. And in 1963, Elizabeth Taylor gave Cleopatra perhaps the most famous modern face of all. Joseph L. Mankiewicz's Cleopatra became one of the grand monuments of historical spectacle. It runs more than 4 hours in its major roadshow form. Its enormous sets, costumes, processions, and royal entrances help define what generations imagined when they heard the name Cleopatra. The film is culturally important. It is not a primary source. The same is true of historical fiction. Margaret George's The Memoirs of Cleopatra, for example, can help a modern storyteller imagine emotional continuity, palace atmosphere, and the inner texture of a life. But a novelist has permission that a historian does not. A novelist can enter Cleopatra's bedroom and tell us what she thought. History cannot. That difference should become one of the strengths of this documentary. Where the evidence is strong, we will tell the story strongly. Where ancient writers disagree, we will say they disagree. Where an anecdote is vivid but uncertain, we will call it an anecdote. Where archaeology remains silent, we will not fill silence with invention and then disguise it as fact. Because Cleopatra does not need fictional additions to become extraordinary. The documented story is already astonishing. Cinema basis. BFI Records Mankiewicz's 1963 Cleopatra. Starring Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, and Rex Harrison at 243 minutes. Margaret George's The Memoirs of Cleopatra is historical fiction and is useful as literary inspiration, not evidence. Chapter 21. The Tomb That Disappeared. And then there is the final mystery. Where is Cleopatra? Ancient accounts say Antony and Cleopatra were granted burial together, but their tomb has never been conclusively identified. Much of ancient Alexandria's royal quarter lies beneath the sea after centuries of subsidence, earthquakes, and coastal change. Underwater archaeology has recovered parts of the vanished royal landscape, but not the Queen's confirmed tomb. For years, archaeologist Kathleen Martinez has pursued another possibility at Taposiris Magna west of Alexandria. Excavations there have uncovered burials, coins bearing Cleopatra's image, a long tunnel, and other material. More recently, researchers identified a submerged ancient port associated with the area. National Geographic's 2025, Cleopatra's Final Secret, brought enormous new public attention to those discoveries. It is fascinating archaeology. It is not proof of Cleopatra's burial. Outside scholars remain skeptical. There is still no inscription saying, Cleopatra was buried here. No securely identified royal chamber. No body. No decisive archaeological chain connecting the queen to a tomb at Taposiris Magna. As of 2026, the burial place remains undiscovered. And somehow that absence feels appropriate. A woman buried beneath so many versions of herself has also lost her physical grave. Perhaps it lies beneath Alexandria. Perhaps some future excavation will change everything. Perhaps the sea keeps it. Perhaps antiquity destroyed it long ago. We do not know. And sometimes the most honest words in history are precisely those. We do not know. Historical basis. National Geographic reported the 2025 discovery of a submerged ancient port near Taposiris Magna, but the find does not establish Cleopatra's burial there. As of May 2026, her tomb remained undiscovered. Final chapter. What Cleopatra actually lost. So what was Cleopatra's story? Was it a love story? Partly. A war story? Certainly. A tragedy? Yes. But perhaps the deepest story is about sovereignty. Cleopatra inherited a kingdom that had spent generations moving ever deeper into Rome's shadow. Her father had needed Roman power to recover his throne. Her own conflict with Ptolemy III became entangled with Caesar's civil war. Caesar restored her. After Caesar's death, Antony offered another Roman alliance. And when Antony lost to Octavian, there was no third Roman strongman waiting to preserve Ptolemaic independence. The system had reached its end. This is why it is too easy to say, Cleopatra ruined Egypt because she loved Antony. Egypt's vulnerability began long before Antony. Rome's expansion began long before Cleopatra. She did not invent the forces that destroyed her kingdom. She tried successfully for years, unsuccessfully in the end, to navigate them. She made dangerous choices. So did every major ruler around her. She pursued power. So did Caesar. So did Antony. So did Octavian. Only one of them emerged from the struggle able to build an empire and supervise the meaning of victory. And that may be Cleopatra's strangest legacy. She lost the war. She lost Egypt. She lost Antony. She lost Caesarion. She lost her dynasty. She even lost control of the story people told about her. And still, she did not disappear. The propaganda survived. But so did the questions. The coins survived. The temple survived. Fragments of papyrus survived. Plutarch survived. Suetonius survived. Alexandria survived in ruins and underwater stone. Her name crossed languages, empires, and centuries. Every generation invented another Cleopatra. Seductress, monster, lover, victim, goddess, strategist, beauty, foreign threat, feminist icon, femme fatale. But the historical woman is harder and more interesting than any single one of them. She was capable without being invincible, educated without being omniscient, ruthless without being uniquely monstrous, charismatic without requiring supernatural beauty, politically brilliant in some moments, politically defeated in the end, human enough to make choices whose consequences she could not control, powerful enough that the most successful Roman politician of her age needed to turn her into an enemy worthy of Rome. Perhaps that is the Cleopatra worth remembering. Not because she conquered Rome. She did not. Not because love was stronger than empire. It was not. But because for more than 2 decades, while Rome's republic destroyed itself through civil war, a queen ruling from Alexandria fought to keep an increasingly vulnerable kingdom alive. In the end, Octavian took Egypt. He became Augustus. His political order would dominate the Mediterranean. Cleopatra's order vanished. Yet more than 2,000 years later, we are still arguing about her face, still searching for her tomb, still examining her coins, still questioning the stories her enemies told, still returning to the river at Tarsus, to the bundle carried into Caesar's room, to the window above Antony, to the closed chamber, to the snake that may never have been there. Rome won the war, but history did not end when Rome said it should. And perhaps that is Cleopatra's final victory. Not that she escaped defeat, but that she escaped oblivion. Pause. Somewhere beneath the waters, ruins or earth of ancient Alexandria, there may still be one final chapter waiting for us. Until then, the last queen of Ptolemaic. Egypt remains exactly where she has been for 2,000 years. Between evidence and legend, between power and memory, between the woman who lived and the woman the world could never stop imagining. Fade to black. Cleopatra VII Philopator. 609 BCE. 39 BCE.